Hello and welcome to what is part number 5 of the 100 Years' War, the very history of England and France. Now, if you haven't watched part number 1, 2, 3 or number 4 yet, stop what you're doing. Go watch those first. The link is in the description down below of this video. And while you are there, please consider liking, commenting and subscribing as well if you haven't yet. Also, you can hit that notifications bell so you know when my next video is out. Now let's get into this. We left off in 1415 when Henry V of England had taken Harfleur Castle. But it was winter and the French were closing in. Henry needed to escape. Thankfully, he had a plan, and England had one foothold in northern France, Calais. Henry V and his army made their way as quick as they could to the city to get away from the French, but they began to slow down. You see, they were weak, and they were in no state to fight because they had what is known as camp fever, dysentery, the biggest killer of medieval warfare. The French were smart and they knew where the English were going because it was obvious they were on their way to Calais because it was the only place for Henry to go. So they blocked the route to Calais near a small village called Agencourt. As the English came up to a hill on a ploughed field between two forests, they sent a rider to see what was over the hill. The rider was met with the might of the full French army waiting for him at the top of the hill. He looked down on the dwindling forces of the English, who were disease-ridden and had felt there was no hope. See, the English only had 6,000 light-armoured longbowmen archers and a couple thousand knights, 8,000 in total. Facing them was an army of fresh and healthy, heavily armoured Frenchmen who numbered 15,000. The French had learnt their lessons at the battles of Crécy and Poitiers, and they understood how lethal the longbows could be from the English, and they had the higher ground. They were also well grouped, so there was no point in rushing into battle. So they waited overnight. They had a big party, and the sounds from the feasts drifted over to the weak, cold, sick and wet English. The next day, on the 25th of October 1415, at daybreak, two armies lined up and waited. And then they waited some more, and it began to pour with rain. The French did not want to charge at the English because they didn't want to be brought down in a storm of arrows from the longbowmen. This invoked a stalemate because the English knew their claim to fame was the longbowmen, and they were useless unless the French charged, and the French were not ready to charge. Henry V needed to do something, so what he did is he mounted his white horse and blew trumpets and yelled, "Now strike!" The entire army moved forward to longbowmen range, and they unleashed a cloud of arrows. This sent the French into a frenzy, and they immediately forgot their plan and charged down on the soaked, ploughed battlefield. Now the story is somewhat legendary. The heavily armoured French army raced down to the English, who were constantly loosing arrows at them. There were even archers hidden in the forest on the either side of the field, which acted as a funnel for the French army. And in the heavily armoured French, they had finally reached the English line, but they were exhausted because it was muddy and they could hardly even stand, never mind fight. These poor souls were hacked down by the light-armoured archers who looked for gaps between the French armour to stab. The knights and nobles among them were taken prisoners, but their numbers grew so large that Henry became worried there would be a prisoner uprising, and he ordered the execution of all of them. And this showed the French that Henry would stop at nothing but victory. This mayhem was witnessed by the French, and they saw all was lost. They turned and fled. The mixture of blood, mud, rain and bodies covered the field in one of Europe's bloodiest 3 hours in history. 400 Englishmen lay dead and 6,000 Frenchmen lay dead. Among them were dukes and nobles, but they had also captured some and they captured the Duke of Orleans, a person called Charles, and John, the Duke of Bourbon, who served Henry V of England dinner as the ultimate humiliation. Even though the battle had been won by the English, the war was still on, and 2 years later, in 1417, Henry V of England came back to France with a new army and a plan to go town to town and once and for all claim all of France for himself and his Plantagenet dynasty. Town to town they went, and they claimed northern France. And by 1418 he captured the royal capital city of Rouen in Normandy, and it held 70,000 citizens. The French Dauphin Charles needed to pull his troops together again, but he needed the help of a duke, the Duke of Burgundy, John the Fearless, who was pretty much as influential and wealthy as the French crown. The two of them didn't see eye to eye because the Dauphin was worried that the Duke would overthrow him and his family and sit on the throne for himself. The Duke, on the other hand, didn't like the way that the Dauphin and the French royal family were jealous of him, perhaps jealous enough to maybe slit his throat. The Duke of Burgundy and the Dauphin of France agreed to meet on a bridge on the 10th of September 1418 to talk things over, where they realized they were both French and they were on the same side. But then the very thinkable happened. The Dauphin ordered his men to hack the Duke to death. This was an act of utter brutality and ruthlessness, but it was so stupid. In fact, 100 years later, spoiler alert here, Francis I of France would go to see the skull of the Duke, and there was a hole there where he had been dealt the final blow. And Francis said, "Here is the hole where the English entered France." The Duke of Burgundy's son, Philip III, was enraged by this. Obviously, his father had been killed, and there was only one person who wanted the Dauphin as dead as he did, Henry V, the English, and he formed an agreement with them to replace the Valois dynasty with that of the Plantagenet dynasty. This pairing turned out to be unstoppable, as their war machine rolled across northern France, even taking Paris itself in 1420. The cards had been dealt to the French, and the mentally ill Charles VI was forced to sign the Treaty of Troyes, which would see Henry V of England marry Charles VI of France's daughter, a person called Catherine of Valois, and their offsprings would be the heirs to the French throne. Just in 1 year, in December 1421, the couple already had a son, the heir. While Henry V brought the French to kneel, his reign as the supreme military leader of Europe was concrete. There was no match for him. However, he did meet a match in camp fever, dysentery, which would eventually deal him the final death blow on the 31st of August 1422. However, before his death, he met with his brother, John the Duke of Bedford, to instruct him on what should happen next, because the King of England would be 9 months old. Henry's brothers, the Duke of Bedford and the Duke of Gloucester, acted as regents along with a council for the infant king. The Duke of Bedford was a rich and powerful man, and he was given rulership over vast lands in France. His other brother, Duke of Gloucester, was somewhat of a hothead, and he wasn't entirely trusted by the Regency Council, so he was made the head of the Regency Council only in name to keep him happy. But he hated this, and he complained like a child, but nonetheless, he was loyal to the crown, and he never rebelled. The Regency Council, along with the dukes, came up with a strategy to keep the English lands that had been won in France and make small defensive raids into France. They fortified the lands that had been taken, and they made the people living there pay taxes to the English, even though they were French. The same year, 1422, that Henry V died of dysentery, Charles VI of France, the king who thought he was made of glass, died, and his bullish son, the Dauphin, became Charles VII of France, right? No. He had been stopped because of the Treaty of Troyes. Henry and Catherine's son was still considered the rightful heir. Charles the Dauphin of France moved his court from Paris to the ancient royal city of Chinon because Paris was held by the English. The Dauphin Charles realized he needed to start to take back land that had been lost to the English, and he met them at the Battle of Venois in 1424, and he got beaten back so badly by the Duke of Bedford that his court was depressed, and people were losing hope. It had been defeat after defeat for 6 years against the English, and the French were at a loss for words. France today belongs to the French and not the English. So how are they going to get themselves out of this depressing slump? Find out in the final installment, part number 6. The end game is near. I really hope you enjoyed that. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you want to watch in the future by commenting down below. Like, comment, subscribe. The more you know.